There's been a progression of thinking and learning theory over the years. Really, it all began with the educational psychologist B.F. Skinner and his thoughts on behaviorism, what he termed behaviorism. That all started in the 1950s, but it all got started with what many of you probably are familiar with. It's the Pavlov's dog research, where Ivan Pavlov would ring a bell and then provide a dog with a treat, and then after a number of trials, take the treat away, and when the bell rang, the dog would salivate. And this was labeled stimulus response conditioning. And B.F. Skinner took this into the education realm, this idea, and the basic idea behind it was something that was called programmed instruction. And the idea was to provide self-paced, small chunks of learning followed by instantaneous feedback, which B.F. Skinner referred to as reinforcement. The idea then would be to take, and it was usually textual in nature, there would be a text passage, then followed by a question about the text passage. If the learner got it right, they would get an instant message telling them, hey, great job. And if they got the question wrong, it would say, oh, well, that's not quite right. Let's try this again. They would go back, reread the passage, and then answer the question. So it was this process of small chunks of information followed by a question, followed by instant feedback. And in this way, the person learned in sort of a new way. And this picture down here, this is B.F. Skinner's teaching machine. Of course, this is before computers. And what he did was he put small discs that had textual information on them. The person would read that little bit of text, would turn a crank to move the disc forward. The disc would ask a question. The student would write an answer on a little piece of paper, and then the disc would move forward again and tell them whether they could match their answer to the piece of paper. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but it was kind of a revolutionary idea at the time. And this is his teaching machine that sort of kicked off the programmed instruction craze at that time. Here's another example. This is from a medical programmed instruction unit. This is from like the 1960s, and this happens to be on the menstrual cycle. So, this would be a page. The individual would be asked to study this, some aspect of this page, and then it would be followed by some questions. They would cover this side with a piece of paper. They would try to answer the question, for example, what structure is present in the ovary following ovulation, and they'd put an answer down. Prior to ovulation, they'd put an answer down. Then they'd pull their piece of paper down and they'd reveal the answers. And of course, that is the feedback. Getting a positive response is a positive reinforcement. This idea has been carried over into computer-based instruction and is used today in many types of computer-based instruction. So I wanted to take a minute and share with you an example of that. Okay, so here's a computer-based instruction module that I authored. Actually, it was authored by a Tech 408 class. Well, they helped with it a few years back. But I'm going to start this. Kind of skip forward.
Would it surprise you that the printing industry employs more than 850,000 people? This makes it the fourth largest manufacturing employer in the United States. Those who work in the graphic communications industry have a chance to develop their technical skills, as well as their artistic and entrepreneurial sensibilities. Pursuing a career in the graphic communication industry might mean relocating to an exciting new city, or it could mean staying close to friends and family. In this section, we will give you an overview of possible careers and insight into the range of professionals that work in a typical graphic communications business.
Okay, so you get the idea. Okay, so this is a computer-based instruction module. It delivered some information There's some navigation over here. This one happens to be on careers in the industry. But what I want you to notice is when I move forward to the next slide, there's a what do you think? And it says click on the best answer. So how many employees work in the printing industry in the United States? So this happens to be an important piece of information that we want the individual to learn from that previous slide. And so if the person was listening carefully and read carefully and remembers, they would be able to answer, it's between, and then they get instant feedback. I'll do that again. We'll answer the wrong one, even more than that. We'll answer the right one. You got it. Answer the wrong one, quite a few more than that. And so you get the idea. This is classic behaviorism. And as they moved through this sequence, this same pattern would happen. The information is interspersed with these reinforcers that pick out the important information and give the learner an opportunity to interact. All right, so that brings us to cognitivism, which was championed by a group of Florida State University faculty in the 1970s. Robert Gagne among them, he's probably the best known. But cognitivism is based around the idea of memory, and a lot of the research that was being done into short-term and long-term memory. And Robert Gagne came up with what are called the 9 events of instruction, teach classroom teachers how to instruct in a really effective manner. And again, it was all based around memory. So it's based, the idea is that educators at the time weren't thinking in terms of tapping into what was already known in the learner, attaching new information to that information, and then looking at memory in different ways. You know, the premise is that new knowledge is connected to existing knowledge in sort of a web within the mind. And I think many of us think about our minds and our memories in this way now, and didn't really before the cognitivism movement of the 1970s. The big thing is to think about what the trainee, in our case, already knows, the prerequisite knowledge, and then customize the instruction around that. That's part of the analysis phase, is figuring out where the trainee already has knowledge, and then closing the gap with gap analysis. But again, we're just focusing on the theory of cognitivism. Here's a couple of things I wanted to point out. This is the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. The idea is that with multimedia presentations like the one we saw a moment ago that I demonstrated, you have a combination of both words and pictures. So you have two things that are being processed simultaneously by the mind. The words are being processed by the ears in the case of the example I showed you a minute ago, but they're also being processed by the eyes because there's text. So we're listening and we're also seeing, and so this is what's referred to as dual channels. We also have pictures on that slide that I showed you a minute ago, or really the one you're looking at right now is the same, and those are being processed through the eyes. So from a sensory standpoint from the brain, we're using a dual channel method processing the information. In working memory, that is short-term memory, the memory that that's immediate, we have sounds and we have images that are being processed by the brain, and we're trying to make sense of those two things simultaneously. And then we're integrating those together along with prior knowledge. So this is a cognitive theory. And we have a limited capacity to process multiple channels simultaneously. And that's something that's important for us to understand as trainers as we develop training. If we overload the learner with both words and pictures and sounds simultaneously, there's sort of an overload in working memory, and it becomes much harder for the average individual to process all of that information. So here are Gagne's 9 events. I wanted to point this out. This is something you might cover in Tech 407. It's probably more applicable to classroom and face-to-face training than perhaps to computer-based training, um, again, this is the model that came out of the cognitivism movement for teachers, and this is taught in education programs pretty much across the country. The idea is to begin by gaining attention. A lot of instructors will gain the class's attention at the beginning and then explain what they're going to do today, give an overview of what kind of instruction is going to take place. And then there's a review of prior information learned, say, last time in the course, last time the course met. And so there's a stimulation of memory of prior learning. Then there's the actual presentation of new information with thought given to the channels that are coming into the brain and keeping those limited so the person can process the information. Then there's a performance or practice element that is demonstrated, and then there's a performance or practice element that the learner will go through that actually applies the information that's been presented. And then feedback is provided based on the performance that's been elicited. There's an assessment of that feedback, and then there is what's called retention and transfer, which is actually applying that information in a job setting. So these are the 9 events of instruction, and if you look at it carefully, you'll see how memory, the idea of memory, is integrated into this. But there's also aspects of behaviorism in here as well, in the sense of providing feedback on the performance. All right, that brings us to the kind of the third major learning theory that was developed kind of in the 1990s. Constructivists believed that cognitive theory and behavioral theory were very limiting in their approach, and that maybe didn't mirror true human experience. And so the constructivists believed that learning occurs in sort of the natural flow of human experience, and that humans by nature are curious and creative. In other words, we're active learners. But in the case of training, if a trainer was to use a constructivist approach, the trainer would be a facilitator, and they would guide the learner to discover information on their own. And the projects that might be given would be kind of unstructured. You're not sure what the outcome is going to be, and the learning is not quite so tightly controlled or measured. Examples would be like games and simulations, role-playing and discussion. You'll probably recognize that a lot of these things are done in the college classroom, particularly at the graduate level, where you're asked to discover information on your own, maybe come to class and present it, and the instructor is more of a facilitator. They don't really guide your learning in a really tight way. They might have high expectations, that's a different thing, but that's referred to as constructivism. In other words, the individual is constructing their own knowledge based on their own unique abilities. So, give yourself a second to think about which learning theory this best describes based on the information we just covered. So, learning occurs when new information is processed and transferred to memory. Well, that would be cognitivism. So the role of the learner is to receive and learn information. The role of the teacher is to present information, guide practice, and provide immediate feedback. How about this one? So learning occurs when a learner actively builds knowledge. So the role of the learner is to make sense of the material, and the role of the teacher is to provide guidance and to create real-life scenarios. If you understood the 3 different types of learning theory we just covered, you'd recognize that as constructivist. And finally, learning occurs as weakening or strengthening of an association between stimulus and response. And that is a situation where the role of the learner is to build knowledge by reacting to right or wrong responses. And the role of the teacher is to administer instruction in chunks and then provide immediate feedback. So that is an example of behaviorism, if you understood the theory that we just covered. So that brings us to what some refer to as training architectures. This is just a different way of sort of applying some of the theories we just talked about and approaches. Here are receptive, directive, and guided discovery. So different what are called architectures of training and e-learning training. So in receptive, we have information acquisition. The interactivity is rather low, and it's typically used for informed training. You'll remember informed versus performed training as we covered earlier. And goals such as new hire information with very low interactivity. Then we have directive, and directive is response strengthening. In other words, information is given, but then there are questions and activities and feedback that's given. The interactivity is medium in this case, and it's used for perform training, such as developing software skills. And then we have guided discovery, and guided discovery is knowledge construction, where we don't have very specific outcomes that we're tightly controlling, but rather the learner constructs the knowledge on their own. In examples would be such as gaming, discussions, role-playing, things of that nature. This is where interactivity is very high, and we perform strategic training goals such as problem solving in sort of a realistic environment. So if you think about it, there are elements of behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism. By the way, those are not three separate things. They interact and meld together. But this has elements of behaviorism. This has elements of constructivism.